So, okay, I will do my kind of introduction background thing first. Okay. So, welcome everyone to this lecture series on mathematical philosophy, organized by Department of Philosophy, Peking University, on the occasion of the centenary of Russell's visit to Peking University. So I'm your host for today, Yanjing Wang. Since this is the first lecture in the series, I will just give you a few words about background and some other, the reason we want to start this series of lectures. Okay, so actually today is almost exactly 100 years after Russell's arrival in Beijing in 1920. So he was invited by his former student Fu Tong and his biggest Chinese fan Zhang Shenfu and the famous Liang Qichao to lecture in Peking University for a year. So the original idea was to lecture mainly on theoretical philosophy, especially the part about the mathematics, because Russell in 1919 just published his book, Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, and opens the field. But 1919 was also a very important year for Chinese, especially for people from Peking University, because that is the year when the main force movement happened, and the movement was led by our faculty members and students in the university. So at that moment, many Chinese intellectuals actually had much higher expectations on Russell's view about social reconstructions of China than, say, for his philosophy or, say, mathematical philosophy. So that caused a little bit confusion at the beginning when Russell arrived in China, because he was invited to so many events and people asked him, okay, so which road should China take? Well, instead of asking some philosophical questions. Yeah, but nevertheless, he managed to give a series of very serious lectures on philosophy at our Peking University. As you can see here, students are waiting for him here. So he gave a lecture series for 4 topics, also including mathematical logic as the last topic. But unfortunately, during one talk, not given in Peking University, but somewhere else, he got a cold and then developed into pneumonia. So he spent quite some time to recover, and he left Beijing on 11th of July in 1921. Yeah, at that time, the conception of mathematical philosophy for Russell is more or less just mathematical logic and a bit of philosophy of mathematics. But 1 century after that, the scope of mathematical philosophy is much more broad. The central point why mathematics and philosophy can go hand in hand with each other is they have the common interest, the abstract structures. For example, in mathematics, you study infinity and randomness. In logic and philosophy, you study truth and semantics. And there are lots of philosophical conceptions which can be made more rigid into mathematical abstract structures, such as all these I listed here. And today we'll touch upon, say, time and causation. And we also have much more tools to study those abstract structures, like various forms of logic and probabilities theory and graph theory, game theory, and so on. By using those tools, we can clarify philosophical assumptions, formulating precisely what are the questions and building models, prove, say, theorems for conclusive statement, and deriving consequences from our assumptions, not only in mathematics, but also in philosophy. This can bring us some more clear and more rigorous philosophy, which are more relevant to our everyday life and other subjects, and is also more applicable. And in nature, they are also interdisciplinary. So that's sort of the background of the mathematical philosophy lecture series that we have in mind. And in particular, I think we learn from Russell's case, pneumonia shouldn't stop us from academic exchange, sincerely. So during this era of pandemic and especially this uneventful year, I think we should continue our academic exchange of ideas and thoughts. We are very honored to have a wonderful list of speakers speaking about various aspects of mathematical philosophy and also philosophy of mathematics. We have talks about causality, counterfactuals. We have talk about semantics, philosophical logic, and the foundation of mathematics. And personally, I'm also very much looking forward to all these wonderful people's talk. Okay, so they are not only leading philosophers, but many of them are also leading mathematicians and computer scientists. Actually, we also have a interdisciplinary audience. So this is what we got from our questionnaire when the participants register for our events. But don't worry, so we have asked the speakers to try to make the talks accessible to a general audience without assuming too much, say, technical background or philosophical background. Yeah. Okay, so I think I shouldn't waste too much time. So this is my great honor to introduce Professor Hugh Price, the speaker of today's talk. Professor Price has been the Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge University for the past 9 years. Actually, he just retired from this chair of professorship last month, right? Very fresh. Okay, so Professor Price has a background in both philosophy and mathematics. He also got a master's degree from Oxford in mathematics and a PhD from Cambridge in philosophy. And he made excellent contribution to philosophy of physics, especially about the era of time and causation. And he also worked on the foundation of language and semantics. He's also well known for his new pragmatism and anti-representationalism. He authored 4 books and edited more books and published articles not only in top philosophical journals, but also in, say, general science journal like Nature and Science. So he's a fellow of British Academy, Australian Academy of Humanities, and he's a past president of Australian Association of Philosophy. He also built a lot of centers, not the conventional, say, centers for, say, analytic philosophy, but all these centers are facing the future. For example, he's one of the founding directors of the Center for Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge. I think that's very, say, advanced, kind of foresee the future challenges of our humanity. And he also built a Center for Time, well, long time ago at the University of Sydney. So in the end, I also want to add Professor Price is a frequent, in recent years, is a frequent visitor to China, and he helped, for example, us to build our Center for Philosophy and the Future of Humanities and connect us with the world for the future challenges. So we are grateful to Professor Price's efforts. Okay, so Today, Professor Price will be speaking about where would we be without counterfactuals. So let's welcome Professor Hugh Price. Hugh, the floor, the screen is yours. Let me stop the, yes.
Thank you, Yanjing, for that kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be visiting, at least in this virtual sense, to be your first speaker in this wonderful series celebrating the centenary of Russell's visit. I'm sorry that we can't be doing it in person. As you say, in recent years, I've been fortunate enough to be a frequent visitor to Beijing. I was last there just a year ago, although it seems much longer because it's been such a difficult year. But I hope that before too long, we'll all be able to get together again. Now to Russell. 108 years ago, on November the 4th, 1912, Bertrand Russell delivered the inaugural address of the Aristotelian Society's 34th session. It was Russell's second year as the president. His lecture was entitled On the Notion of Cause, and as the proceedings here note, a discussion followed in which a number of members took part. Outside the Aristotelian Society, the discussion of this famous lecture continues to this day. Russell's paper remains both influential and controversial. It's known as the source of one of the most famous lines in 20th century philosophy. The law of causation, Russell declares, like much that passes muster among philosophers, is a relic of a bygone age, surviving, like the monarchy, only because it's erroneously supposed to do no harm. There's the first page of the proceedings, and there at the bottom is that famous line about causation in the monarchy. Now, as it happens, this paper is really the one piece of Russell's entire philosophical output with which my own work connects directly, and certainly the only one where I make any claim to have advanced the matters under discussion. So 8 years ago, almost to the day, I took advantage of this happy coincidence to use my own inaugural lecture to the Cambridge chair that now bears Russell's name to celebrate the centenary of Russell's famous paper and to talk about what its conclusions look like with the benefit of a century's hindsight. Well, today we have a different centenary to celebrate. In October 2020, 8 years after his causation lecture, Russell arrived in Shanghai at the beginning of a visit to China that, as Yanjing told us, brought him to Beijing. He stayed in this room in a hotel in Shanghai. As I said, it took him 8 years after his causation lecture to get there. In my case, thanks to the faster pace of modern life, it took me less than 5 years. I stayed in the same room in August 2017 on my first visit to Shanghai. But back to the story of Russell's paper and its impact. It's a story with a lot of Cambridge connections. Indeed, I'm not the first occupant of the chair to mention Russell's paper in an inaugural lecture. Elizabeth Anscombe does so in her piece called Causality and Determination from 1971. Anscombe says, Russell wrote of the notion of cause, or at any rate of the law of causation. He seemed to feel the same way about cause itself, that, like the British monarchy, it had been allowed to survive because it had been erroneously thought to do no harm. In a destructive essay of great brilliance, Anscombe says, Russell argued that upon examination, the concepts of determination and of invariable succession of like objects upon like turn out to be empty. They do not differentiate between any conceivable course of things and any other. Now, my concerns are different from Anscombe's, but I will follow her in one respect in interpreting Russell's target broadly rather than narrowly. Anscombe takes it to include cause as well as the law of causation. I'm going to take it to include a broad class of counterfactual judgments, judgments of the form, if A had not happened, B would not have happened. I don't suggest that Russell himself took his thesis to extend this far, But the history of the subject since Russell's time has shown that such counterfactuals are closely connected, not only to causation in general, but to some of the specific issues about causation at the core of Russell's paper. And in particular, one of Russell's key arguments concerns the time asymmetry of causation, the fact that effects are supposed to occur later than their causes. Russell says that there's nothing to ground such a difference between past and future in fundamental physics. More recent writers have noted that there's a similar time asymmetry in counterfactual reasoning. If my internet connection had failed at the beginning of this lecture, for example, the proceedings since that moment might well have been different. I wouldn't have progressed this far, for example, and you wouldn't have been able to hear me. But events before the failure of the internet would presumably have been just the same, or at least so our intuitions tell us. David Lewis calls this the asymmetry of counterfactual dependence and proposes to use it to explain the asymmetry of causation that Russell had taken to be missing in fundamental physics. Well, a good question at this point, obviously, is where the time asymmetry of counterfactual dependence comes from, if Russell is right and there isn't anything suitable in fundamental physics. I'll come back to that question. For the moment, I mentioned it to make the point that we can't sensibly discuss the issues raised by Russell's paper without broadening the scope in this way to include counterfactuals. But broadening the scope raises the stakes. Russell seemed to be suggesting that abandoning talk of causality would be practical as well as desirable, much as he thought that abandoning the monarchy might be. Some planning, a few days of mild confusion, and it would all be done. Indeed, he thought that modern physics, vanguards of the conceptual revolution, had already made the change. He says, this is again on the first page, all philosophers of every school imagine that causation is one of the fundamental axioms or postulates of science. Yet, oddly enough, in advanced sciences such as gravitational astronomy, the word cause never occurs. Russell then singles out for criticism his former teacher, James Ward, who was actually the very first holder of the chair that is now the Russell Chair. Here's Ward on the left. Russell says that Ward makes the fact that the advanced sciences don't mention causation, quote, a ground for complaint against physics. The business of science, Ward apparently thinks, should be the discovery of causes, yet physics never even seeks them. To this, Russell replies, to me, it seems that philosophy ought not to assume such legislative functions, and that the reason why physics has ceased to look for causes is that, in fact, there are no such things. And after that, we get the famous line about the monarchy. But even if Russell is right about physics, the idea that we could dispense with talk of causality, much as we might dispense with the monarchy, still seems wildly unrealistic. And the point is even more obvious when we notice the way in which counterfactuals are liable to be swept up in the same net. For my text here, I'm going to give you some wise words I once heard attributed to the late American philosopher Jerry Fodor. It takes the form of a riddle. Fodor asks, why is real estate in Manhattan so expensive? And the answer is, you're paying for all those counterfactuals. In other words, you're paying for all the opportunities that you get if you live in somewhere like Manhattan. But imagine the consequences if Fodor's news, that this is why counterfactuals matter, and Russell's news leak out at the same time. The value of your apartment depends on its counterfactuals, but Bertrand Russell, no less, tells us that there are no counterfactuals. So the whole Manhattan real estate market is a gigantic kind of fraud scheme, built not on sand, not even on paper, but literally on nothing. It's unthinkable. And literally so, perhaps, if counterfactual thought is to be imagined groundless, and yet we need a counterfactual to ask the question, as in my title. When I gave the original version of this lecture 8 years ago, it so happened that a day or two before, I think actually on the 30th of October, there'd been a huge storm which had flooded parts of Manhattan. And I found this lovely picture online, which makes the point that the residents of Manhattan like to take advantage of the counterfactuals, even in the middle of one of the worst storms in their history. Now, at this point, we might defend Russell by suggesting that his real target is much more modest. His view about the word cause, as he puts it, is that it's so inextricably bound up with misleading associations as to make its complete exclusion from the philosophical vocabulary desirable, and that there are no causes at a fundamental level in physics. But that view is compatible, maybe, with it recognizing a non-fundamental role for causal vocabulary in counterfactuals too, in non-fundamental parts of physics and in everyday life. Provided we could find such a non-fundamental role, then we might save the real estate market, indeed the finance itself, the finance system itself, because what is money except a convenient form of exchangeable counterfactuals? Without treating talk of causation and counterfactuals as tracking some deep, God-given feature of the furniture of reality. After all, remember the first three laws of real estate. I don't know whether these laws are known in China, but certainly in my part of the world, here in Sydney, where people are crazy about real estate, everybody knows the three laws of real estate, which are location, location, location. In other words, location is the only thing that matters. Those laws, of course, to survive the discovery that there's no such thing as absolute space. So we could defend Russell by taking him, like Hume before him, to be proposing only a kind of armchair revolution. He wants to banish causation from the kind of serious conversation that goes on in Trinity College, maybe, without banishing it from the streets. But even this modest armchair revolution seems to be undone by a famous paper by Nancy Cartwright from 1979, a paper called Causal Laws and Effective Strategies. Cartwright begins in this paper with Russell's distinction between symmetric laws of association, the kind of Humean regularities Russell thinks that modern physics actually offers us, and the asymmetric causal laws Russell thinks we need to dispense with, at least in the armchair. Cartwright notes that Russell argues for two conclusions, as she puts it. First, that the laws of association are all the laws there are, and second, that causal principles cannot be derived from the causally symmetric laws of association. And Cartwright says she's going to argue in support of Russell's second claim, but against the first. So that is, she agrees that causal principles cannot be derived from the causally symmetric laws of association, but she maintains that they can't be done away with. We need causal laws too. And her argument is that causal laws are needed to ground an important distinction between effective and ineffective strategies. And she illustrates this point with an example, with some examples. One of them, a letter she tells us she received from an insurance company. Here's the letter, or a quote from it. It says, "It simply wouldn't be true to say, Nancy Cartwright, if you own a TIAA life insurance policy, you'll live longer." But then the letter continues, "But it is a fact, nonetheless, that people insured by TIAA do enjoy longer lifetimes on average than persons insured by commercial insurance companies that serve the general public." And you see what they're trying to do here. They're trying to trick the reader of the letter into buying an insurance policy, when, of course, it won't, buying an insurance policy isn't an effective strategy for living longer. Of course, they should have picked somebody else to try this trick on, and not Nancy Cartwright. Okay, so Cartwright argues that the objective fact reported in the first line of the letter, namely that buying life insurance from this company would not be an effective strategy for living longer, that depends on causal rather than merely probabilistic facts about the world. But she argues the objectivity of strategies requires the objectivity of causal laws. In other words, causal laws cannot be done away with because they're needed to ground the distinction between effective strategies and ineffective ones. The difference between the two depends on the causal laws of our universe and on nothing weaker. So that's Cartwright's argument against Russell. It says we can't follow Russell in throwing out causation because we need it to explain this distinction between effective and ineffective strategies. Well, commenting on Cartwright's arguments in a recent survey paper, Hartree-Field concludes, this makes a compelling case against Russell's view that we should do without causal notions. But Cartwright herself draws a much stronger conclusion, a kind of causal hyperrealism. She holds that the causal fact that a force on an object makes the object go faster is not reducible to Newton's second law, nor to other non-causal facts either, such as the equations of energy flow. Such equations are just further parts of fundamental physics, which she regards as laws of association rather than as causal. Rather, the claim that a force on an object makes the object go faster states a further truth about the world that physics leaves out. Evidently, there's some sort of causal fluid that's not taken account of in the equations of physics. Just how it is that we are supposed to have access to its properties, I'm not sure, says Field. Well, as you can probably tell, Field finds this kind of hyperrealism unpalatable, but he recognized the importance of Cartwright's challenge to Russell. As he says, despite the implausibility of the hyperrealist picture, we have a problem to solve. The problem of reconciling Cartwright's points about the need of causation in the theory of effective strategy with Russell's points about the limited role of causation in physics. He says, this is probably the central problem in the metaphysics of causation. Well, I agree with Field in this assessment, except that I think it's better to say that it's one of two central problems, the other one being Russell's issue of the time asymmetry of causation. Accounting for that is a further difficulty for the hyperrealist view, but it's a problem for all views of causation, including views which want to regard it as something relatively non-fundamental. Okay, so let's turn to Russell now. Russell's own treatment of the problem of the apparent time asymmetry of causation is important more because he sees that there is a problem than because he provides any satisfactory solution or dissolution. Let's have a look at the central passage in Russell's paper. He puts his cards on the table straight away. He says, we all regard the past as determined simply by the fact that it has happened. But for the accident that memory works backwards and not forwards, we should regard the future as equally determined by the fact that it will happen. So in other words, Russell is claiming there's no real distinction between past and future, but an axiom about us, the fact that our memory works backwards in time and not forwards in time, tricks us into thinking that there is. Well, he then counters this claim with a plausible objection. He says, but we are told you cannot alter the past, while you can to some extent alter the future. In reply to this, Russell makes 2 points. The first is that while it's true that you cannot make the past other than it was, this is just a matter of logic, and the same is true with respect to the future. The second point, acknowledging, I think, that the first has not got to the heart of the matter, introduces what turns out to be an important link between what we think we can influence and what we can know. He says, if you happen to know the future, e.g. in the case of a forthcoming eclipse, it's just as useless to wish it different as to wish the past different. Well, Russell's self-scripted interlocutor here, he's writing both sides of the argument, and his opponent now does a good job of getting things back on track. He said, but it will be rejoined, our wishes can cause the future sometimes to be different from what it would be if they did not exist, and they can have no such effect on the past. Even though we often don't know the past, it would have been useful to add. I think that at this point, Russell loses his grip on the force of his opponent's arguments. This is what he says. This again is a mere tautology, an effect being defined as something subsequent to its cause. Obviously, we can have no effect on the past. But we could just give Russell the terms cause and effect defined in this way, defined in a way which builds in the direction of time, and press the original objection as a question as to why it never makes sense to act or to wish for ends which, while not effects of our actions, being ruled out as such by this definition because they lie in the past, are nevertheless desirable from our point of view. So why is it useless to do something now to ensure that my ticket was the winning ticket in the lottery drawn yesterday, for example, if I don't yet know that it's not? call this the problem of the time asymmetry of deliberation. Russell doesn't get this problem into focus, I think. You can't avoid the question by saying that an end for which we act is by definition an effect of our action, because then you have two definitions of effect in play, one in terms of deliberation and one in terms of time, and you'd need to know why they line up. That's just the original problem again. Well, Russell sums up like this. He says, the facts seem to be merely one, that wishing generally depends upon ignorance and is therefore commoner in regard to the future than in regard to the past. And two, that where a wish concerns the future, it and its realization very often form a practically independent system, i.e., many wishes regarding the future are realized. But there seems no doubt that the main difference in our feelings arises from the fact that the past, but not the future, can be known by memory. So I want to emphasize 3 points about Russell's conclusions here. First, he's trying to explain the time asymmetry of causal dependence as a product of a difference in us rather than a fundamental difference in reality. He's explaining it in terms of the fact that our memory works backwards and not forwards. And as I'll explain, I think he's right about that, although he picks the wrong feature of us. So that brings me to point 2. The difference he picks concerns memory, but it's doubtful whether that can do the trick. It doesn't draw a clean enough cut between the past and the future because we remember rather little of the past and know some of the future by other means. And thirdly, Russell already has on the table the idea that the business of realization of our wishes, as he quaintly puts it, is important in explaining the illusion of asymmetry. Although hampered by the thought that it's all about memory, he doesn't get very far with this idea. But that positions us for the next step in this story, which belongs to perhaps the greatest of all these early 20th century Cambridge giants, namely Frank Ramsey. The step in question occurs in Ramsey's very late paper, General Propositions of Causality, which is a rough 30-page manuscript. You see 3 pages here, dated September 1929, just 4 months before Ramsey's tragically early death at the age of 26. About 2/3 of the way through, on the pages you see here, Ramsey turns to the issue of the difference between past and future and the direction of causality. And then in a few short paragraphs, a little more than 2 handwritten pages, he dissects his way to the core of the problem and shows us what he takes to lie at its heart. But as usual, Ramsey is too brisk for most philosophers, as Hugh Mellor said of a different piece of Ramsey in his own Inaugural Lecture in 1988. And unusually, I think Ramsey doesn't quite get everything right. But he does give us an answer to both the puzzles we have on the table. The one from Cartwright and the one from Russell about the time asymmetry of causation. What I'm going to do now is to give you the core of the relevant passages from these 3 pages and then highlight the key points I think it contains. Ramsey says, it is, it seems, a fundamental fact that the future is due to the present, but the past is not. What does this mean? It's not clear, and if we try to make it clear, it turns into nonsense or a definition. What then do we believe about the future that we do not believe about the past? The past we think is settled. If this means more than that it is past, it might mean that it is settled for us, that any present event is irrelevant to the probability for us of any past event. But that's plainly untrue. What is true is this, that any possible present, well, he first writes action and then crosses it out and writes volition. Any possible present volition of ours is for us irrelevant to any past event. To another or to ourselves in the future, it can serve as a sign of the past, but to us now, what we do affects only the probability of the future. He says, this seems to me to be the root of the matter. That I cannot affect the past is a way of saying something quite clearly true about my degrees of belief. Again, from the situation when we are deliberating, seems to me to arise the general difference of cause and effect. We are then engaged not on a disinterested knowledge or classification, to which this difference is utterly foreign, but on tracing the different consequences of our possible actions, which we naturally do in sequence forward in time, proceeding from cause to effect, but not from effect to cause. We can produce A or A prime, which produces B or B prime, which etc. The probabilities of A and B are mutually dependent, but we come to A first from our present volition. In a sense, he says, my present action is an ultimate and the only ultimate contingency. Well, let me outline what I take to be the key ideas that Ramsey's making in this passage. First of all, very clearly, he's making the point that he thinks that agency is the key to understanding causation. Ramsey thinks that causation, especially the asymmetry of causation, the difference between cause and effect, needs to be understood by thinking about, as he puts it, the situation when we are deliberating. This idea turns up in later writers, including at least 3 of them with Cambridge connections. First was Douglas Gaskin, an Australian who was a student in Cambridge in the 1930s, and later a lecturer at the University of Melbourne, and who defends the paper in A Wonderful Lecture in Mind in 1955. The second was G.H. von Wright, who was briefly Wittgenstein's successor in this chair, who defended such a view in the 1970s, long after he left Cambridge. In Oxford, Collingwood had proposed it in the 1940s. But so far as I know, none of these writers recognized that Ramsey was onto the idea first, nor gets anywhere close to the insights that connect Ramsey's version of the view to the issues raised by Russell's paper. Later, in the early 1990s, I also defended a version of this agency view, both in joint work with my Australian colleague Peter Menzies and elsewhere. And this time Ramsey does get a mention, as do issues such as the time asymmetry of causation and Cartwright's challenge to Russell. And more recently still, the idea that causation needs to be understood in terms of manipulation, as people now say, has been very prominent over the past, well, probably 20 years, thanks to the work of the philosopher Jim Woodward and the computer scientist Judea Pearl, amongst others. But Ramsey was the first, I think. That's the first point. The second point is that probability looks different from an agent's point of view. Ramsey's key insight is that agents are epistemically special. Probability judgments are properly different from an agent's first-person point of view than from a third-person point of view, even that of the same agent at other times. Ramsey puts this initially as the claim that our present volitions are for us probabilistically independent of any past event. He doesn't actually tell us why this is so, but he does give us a hint at the end, where he said, my present action is an ultimate and the only ultimate contingency. What he has in mind, I think, is a generalization of a familiar point about how knowledge and free choice conflict. And if you remember Russell, it was clear that Russell had some of this point in mind. It doesn't make sense to take yourself to be choosing between options, one of which you know to obtain. Remember Russell's example of the eclipse, known in advance. Russell pointed out that there's no point in wishing that the eclipse doesn't happen. And the point emerges in the oddity of saying something like, I know I'll vote for Biden, but I'm still making up my mind. You take away with one hand the authority you bestow with the other, much as in Moore's paradox when you say P, but I don't believe that P. Ramsey generalizes this point from knowledge to credence so that it becomes the claim that an agent cannot take herself to have evidence about what she's going to do as she deliberates. Thus it becomes what more recently has been called the thesis that deliberation crowds out prediction. From the agent's point of view, her contemplative action must be regarded as probabilistically independent of anything she does know at present, even if other people or she herself at other times could legitimately take something of that kind as evidence about her choice or vice versa. And in my view, this is the key to solving Field's puzzle. The differences Cartwright rightly points to between the probabilities we get from laws of association on the one hand and the probabilities associated with what we take to be causal dependencies on the other, are precisely the differences induced by the specialness of agency. Cartwright is right in thinking that we can't explain effective strategy in terms of the former, in terms of the probabilities from laws of association, but wrong to think that we need causal laws to give us the latter. On the contrary, as I think Ramsey first saw, it's the other way around. The specialness of the agent's perspective grounds our talk of causation. This brings us to the time asymmetry of causation. And here I think Ramsey is at least looking in the right direction, saying that it depends on tracing the different consequences of our possible actions, which we naturally do in sequence forward in time. Since Ramsey has already appealed to the idea that there are no dependencies between our present actions and events in the past, the qualification naturally is in a sense unneeded. If Ramsey is right, then there are no dependencies except forward in time. To try and illustrate this idea, imagine turtles hatching on an east-facing beach, such as this beach in the Bay of Bengal. Is it any surprise that their journey takes them asymmetrically to the east? No, because there are no routes to the west from the turtle's point of view. Still, the term naturally is useful in another sense. It reminds us that we're appealing to features of our natures, a universal feature for us, albeit perhaps a contingent one. As structures in space-time, we human agents all share a common temporal orientation. Imagine depicting our deliberative lives on a space-time map, with a little arrow connecting each instance of deliberation to its associated action, where there is one. For us, all those little arrows point in the same direction, from past to future, as we would normally put it. Or to go back to the turtles, think of yourself as a beach and of your own plans and deliberations as the turtles that hatch on that beach. What's true is not only that all plans hatch in the same direction on each beach individually, but also that all the beaches we know of face in the same direction. It's an interesting question whether there could be creatures elsewhere whose beaches face in the other direction, whose plans hatch from future to past by our standards. And the answer is probably yes, in my view, so long as they are far enough away in space-time to live in a region with low entropy in what we call the future, rather than in what we call the past. But that's a very long story, although it's a story that I've discussed at length in other places. The point is that universality amongst us, individually and collectively, is quite enough to explain our sense that the direction of causation is an a priori matter. It is a priori if you're built as we are, and if causation depends on agency, in the sense that Ramsey suggests. Okay, to the fourth point. In making agency central in this way, in spotting the special character of an agent's epistemic perspective, and in seeing the work it can do in giving us an account of the difference between cause and effect, I think Ramsey gets much further than Russell. But there's one respect in which Russell still outdoes him, in my view. Ramsey actually gives us no reason at all why the epistemic bifurcation he identifies, the split between things for which our present volition can count as evidence and things for which it can't, should line up neatly with the future-past distinction. He asserts confidently that it does, or at least that the entire past lies on the latter side of the line. He says, what is true is this, that any possible present volition of ours is for us irrelevant to any past event. But he offers no argument for this point, or explanation of the fact in question, if it is a fact. Russell at least has a stab at it, associating it with the fact that the past but not the future can be known by memory. This part of the puzzle wasn't properly sorted out until the 1960s, I think, when the Oxford philosopher Michael Dummett pointed out that one could quite coherently take oneself to affect the past. That is, in Ramsey's terms, take one's present volitions to be relevant to some past event, so long as one didn't also take oneself to be able to know about the relevant part of the past before one acted. And Dummett points out that the knowledge condition might coherently be held to fail. There might be past events of which we thought we couldn't have knowledge, at least at present, even in principle. And if so, it isn't incoherent to think that we might affect them by bringing about some state of affairs in the future, with which in turn they are reliably correlated. Our initial action has to lie in the future, of course. That's just the point above about the turtles on the east-facing beach needing to swim east to get away from the beach. But in Dummett's picture, our influence can then zigzag back into the past, much as our turtles might swim west if gaps or inlets in the beach permitted it. I tried to find a suitable picture of turtles to go with this. I couldn't find ones of them swimming, but at least some of the turtles in this picture are clearly confused about which way they should be heading. In this respect, then, I think that Ramsey misses something important. He's right about the character of the difference between cause and effect, but wrong about how it needs to line up with the distinction between past and future. Dummett shows how it might be false that, as Ramsey puts it, any possible present volition of ours is for us irrelevant to any past event. Now, Dummett's own motivating interest in this question, I think, was in the rather theological question of the efficacy of retrospective prayer, of praying that something will have happened in the past. But I think his ideas have a more down-to-earth application in the case of quantum mechanics. The reason we haven't noticed the gaps in the beach being that they're so small, as it were. Now, this is admittedly not a popular view of quantum mechanics, and I don't have time to explain it here. But I would like to put on record the view that the reason it's remained unpopular is in part because people who think about such things are unaware of the deep insight of Ramsey's view of causation, that it's the agent who's in the driver's seat in determining the direction of causation in nature, and not the other way around. Or if they are aware of it, they haven't also noticed what Ramsey got wrong and Dummett got right, that the resulting causal error need not point exclusively to the future. Okay, well, setting aside the last point about the possibility of backward causation, let's summarize what we get from Ramsey. I think what we get from him are at least the beginnings of answers to the two big puzzles about causation that we identified earlier. The first of them was Field's challenge. Ramsey shows us how to reconcile Cartwright with Russell without hyperrealism. Ramsey's special agent gives us the distinction Cartwright shows us that we need between probabilistic dependencies encoded in the objective laws of association and those that survive from the point of view of the deliberating agent. And that's all we need to give us a distinction between effective and ineffective strategies. Secondly, Ramsey gives us the beginnings of an account of the direction of causation. The difference between cause and effect is accounted for in terms of what we can manipulate to do what, and the prevailing temporal orientation of this causal error is explained in terms of a contingent asymmetry in us, the fact that we deliberate past to future. And the upshot is that Russell comes off rather well. If Ramsey is right, then so too is Russell about the claim that causation is not as fundamental as many philosophers have thought. And more on this in a moment, but first I want to say a word about counterfactuals. So where do counterfactuals fit in? A couple of pages earlier in General Propositions and Causality, the manuscript I showed you before, Ramsey has this to say about the kind of conditional judgments we need in practical deliberation. He says, when we deliberate about a possible action, we ask ourselves, what will happen if we do this or that? If we give a definite answer of the form, if I do P, Q will result, this can probably be regarded as a material implication or disjunction, either not P or Q. But it differs, of course, from any ordinary disjunction in that one of its members is not something of which we're trying to discover the truth, but something it's within our power to make true or false. And then he adds a footnote that says, it's possible to take one's future voluntary action as an intellectual problem. Shall I be able to keep it up? But only by dissociating one's future self. And then he says, our conduct is largely determined by these hypothetical beliefs. And in effect, I think that what Ramsey is claiming here is that the kind of conditionals we need in deliberation are not counterfactuals, not claims about what would be the case if something had been different. They're hypotheticals claims about what is true in the future if something is the case, for a very special kind of something, namely propositions that can't be intellectual problems, as he puts it, because we take them to be within our power to make true or false. And if Ramsey is right about this, then I think it means that we don't need counterfactuals, where many people have thought that we do need them as a foundation for our theory of decision. And in a sense, this is a parallel conclusion to the conclusion that we don't need Cartwright's hyperrealism about causation. Instead, we have the prospect that we might be able to explain talk of counterfactuals in terms of these simpler kinds of hypotheticals. And something like this idea has been proposed by the psychologist Alison Gopnik, I think. Her idea is that we can deploy these deliberative hypothetical skills not merely online when facing real choices, but also offline when facing imaginary choices, or perhaps a better way to put it, when imagining that we are facing real choices. As Gopnik puts it, counterfactuals are the price we pay for hypotheticals. They're a kind of byproduct of hypotheticals we need in decision, combined with our faculty of imagination. Again, I don't have time to explore this idea in any detail here, but the point I want to make is simply that if it's correct, then it will give us a satisfyingly Russellian account of counterfactuals, just as Ramsey's main proposal does for causation. So, are there causes if Ramsey is right? I think the answer is yes, but they're not as much a part of the furniture as we might have thought. Causation goes on the side of the secondary qualities, to use an analogy I explored in an early paper with Peter Menzies. Or as Richard Corrie and I noted in a recent collection, we can characterize this option in terms of Russell's own constitutional metaphor. In the political case, we can distinguish three views of political authority. The traditional monarchist at one extreme takes political authority to be vested in our rulers by God. If we reject that view, we have two choices. There's the anarchist option of rejecting the notion of political authority altogether, or there's the milder Republican option, which agrees with the traditional monarchist that there is political authority, but sees it as a social creation vested in our rulers by us. And by analogy, the Republican option exists in metaphysics too. This was the way in which Richard Corrie and I developed the metaphor. Causal republicanism is thus the view that although the notion of causation is useful, perhaps indispensable in our dealings with the world, it's a category provided neither by God nor by physics, but rather constructed by us. From this Republican standpoint, then, thinking of a limitativism about causality as the sole alternative to full-blown realism is like thinking of anarchy as the sole alternative to the divine right of kings. Now, as I noted earlier, there's an issue about where we put Russell. Is he an anarchist or a Republican in this new terminology? I suggested that we might see him with Hume as what now counts as a kind of armchair anarchist, happy to retain talk of causation and counterfactuals for ordinary purposes. But that's really the Republican option, or at least the reflective, clear-headed version of the Republican option that wants to combine a full-blooded participation in ordinary ways of speaking with a detached, over-the-shoulder understanding of how we come to speak that way and how it might have been otherwise. For example, if we hadn't been agents. A good phrase for this combination, I think, is contingency, irony, and solidarity, in the words of Richard Rorty, another one of my philosophical heroes. Well, how is this sort of story about counterfactuals and causation going to be taken by the market? It won't be a shock, presumably, to learn that market values reflect the subjective preferences we humans have for various possible ends and outcomes. All of this depends on the fact that we are creatures who operate under uncertainty. All our lives we are, in a sense, betting, as Ramsey puts it. What the Republican view of causation does is to extend the story to the case of creatures who are also agents. They intervene in the environment about which they hold such beliefs and preferences. Certainly, the story shows that causal and counterfactual talk would be unneeded for creatures who didn't do that. Intelligent trees, for example, as Michael Dummett once suggested. But that's no threat to the real estate market, of course, unless the people of Manhattan become a whole lot more passive than they've tended to be in the past. Okay, so much for causation. But when it occurred to me that I had an opportunity to celebrate the centenary of Russell's paper on the notion of cause for my inaugural lecture, I was curious about what Russell had had in mind in the other part of his famous line. Just what, in Russell's view, is the harm that the monarchy is erroneously thought not to do? Now, I'd assume that this would be an easy curiosity to satisfy. Somewhere, presumably, Russell would have expressed his views about the monarchy at greater length. But I searched in vain. Eventually, I wrote to Professor Nicholas Griffin of the Russell Archives at McMaster University in Canada. He told me that there really was nothing to find, not even in Russell's correspondence. But he did suggest a context for Russell's remark. In 1910, Britain had concluded a considerable constitutional crisis brought on by the then Liberal government's determination to remove the veto power of the unelected House of Lords, the upper house of the British Parliament. A crucial step had been the King's indication that he would support the government, if necessary, by creating a sufficient number of new Liberal peers to ensure the passage of the bill through the House of Lords. And the House of Lords had to vote for a bill restricting its own powers. But if they voted, if they hadn't been prepared to do that, the King could have created more peers to create a majority for the view. And apparently Russell himself would have been one of those new peers in that counterfactual world. Professor Griffin suggested in the light of the King's support, some on the liberal, progressive side of politics were inclined to say that the monarchy wasn't so bad at all, and that Russell may have been taking the opportunity to indicate that he was made of sterner stuff, and that the old battle lines of the Russells, his family had been involved in progressive politics for generations. Those battle lines remained unchanged. But that doesn't tell us what Russell thought that the harm in question actually was at that point in the nation's history, when, thanks in part to Russell's own ancestors, it had long been what the poet Tennyson called a crowned republic, a fact reaffirmed and strengthened in the crisis in 1910, of course. So as my centenary footnote to Russell's great paper, I thought I could finish by giving you my own view. In my view, there's a significant cost to modern constitutional monarchies that's remarkable, among other things, for the fact that although it's in plain sight, it goes unmentioned and apparently almost unnoticed. As you'll see, it's a relic of a bygone age whose significance is hidden from us by the sheer familiarity of the system of which it's a consequence, by the fact that a traditional picture holds us in its grip, as Wittgenstein might have put it. And while I'm not suggesting that this is what Russell actually had in mind, it is, as you'll see, something that he in particular would have had reason to have in mind. It resonates in several ways with significant aspects of his own life. And it also connects in a deep way with the themes I've been talking about so far, in particular the theme of counterfactuals. So in all senses then, it's an excellent fit. I can introduce the point by noting a difference of opinion with most of my Australian compatriots. The majority of Australians apparently appear to favour an Australian republic, even though many of them voted against it when they had the chance about 20 years ago because they didn't like the particular model on offer. But the main reason given is that Australia should have an Australian head of state rather than the British monarch. The present, the British monarch is Australia's head of state, as has been the case for 120 years since the foundation of the modern state of Australia. And while I don't disagree with the sentiment that Australia should have an Australian head of state, I do think it misses a much more powerful appeal to the country's professed values. Australia's next head of state under present arrangements is a man whose affection for the country dates from 1966, when he was sent here for a couple of terms to a boarding school. Here he is at Heathrow Airport on a gloomy day in January 1966, being farewelled by his father. And here he is, much more cheerful a few days later, when he's discovered the benefits of Australian sunshine. And here he is dropping in on the Australian Prime Minister with his grandmother, the Queen Mother, a few months later. But this is Prince Charles, of course, the present heir to the British throne, and therefore the next head of state in Australia as things stand. Now, this was a formative experience for Prince Charles, apparently. As he put it recently, if you want to develop character, go to Australia. Going on to mention some of the character building epithets employed by his Australian schoolmates. Well, I feel very much on the same wavelength as Prince Charles at this point, because I encountered those same character building opportunities, and no doubt the same epithets, the very same year as a teenage migrant from the UK. I arrived in the country with my family just 3 weeks after Charles left. Here I am at the age of 13, helping my father with the packing in the UK before we came to Australia on this Italian ship. And here I am with some of the rest of the family on holiday the following year at some east-facing beach. Well, despite this near conjunction in Australia, my life and Prince Charles's life diverged quite markedly after that point. He came to Trinity College as an undergraduate 50 years ago and has now served his country and the Commonwealth with considerable distinction. I went as an undergraduate to ANU, the Australian National University in Canberra, making the first of many choices that turned out to lead, happily and rather astoundingly, to my own years in Trinity and Cambridge. But the particular difference I want to highlight is that in common with most of my generation in countries such as Britain and Australia, I made choices about what to do with my life, whereas he didn't, to an unusual extent. Significant as his life's work is to the country, the boy on the left there did not have the opportunity to choose it or to volunteer for it in any meaningful sense. So that's why I disagree with most of my compatriots, Republicans and monarchists alike, about the issue of an Australian republic. They think that the question turns on the importance or otherwise of Australia having an Australian head of state. I think that's a trivial matter, a mere sideshow, compared to the principle that all young people should be allowed to choose for themselves what they do with their lives when they grow up. I mean, of course, I don't mean that all young children should be able to choose absolutely anything, but I do mean that all, more or less, all young children should have the same opportunities. The professed Australian value I mentioned a moment ago is simply that of fairness, or a fair go, as Australians say. It seems to me profoundly and manifestly unfair to select children by accident of birth for future public office. Unfair to the children themselves, the ones selected, and especially if so, of course, for such an important, symbolic and public office. And hence entirely inappropriate that Australia's constitution should make us party to a practice of doing so. Now, apart from the fact that Australians like to make a fuss about fairness, there's nothing uniquely Australian about the point, of course. It applies with equal force in all the modern democratic monarchies, most of which, almost all of which, 8 in total, neglecting some tiny principalities, are in Europe. The 8 countries in question, 3 Scandinavian countries, 3 Benelux countries, and Spain and Britain, all those countries actually care just as much about fairness as Australians do, of course. So it's an issue for all of them in just the same way. I think it will be easy to see why I think this point is Russellian in spirit. As is well known, Russell felt the constrictions of his own childhood very deeply and was greatly relieved to escape them when he came of age and when he escaped to Trinity College. Later, when he himself became a father, Russell was a famous advocate of allowing children as much freedom as possible. And finally, of course, he was also a famous opponent of conscription. It would be a little extreme, perhaps, to compare hereditary monarchy to conscription. A neutral term might be involuntary service, as prohibited by the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. In that case, the US Supreme Court later ruled that the amendment did not prohibit service properly rendered to the state, such as military conscription or jury duty. But as those cases make clear, it would be unthinkable that these exclusions might be lifetime matters or apply to individuals chosen in infancy. It would be unthinkable in any other democracy too if we were starting from scratch. someone proposed that we should fill public offices by selecting infants who would be brought up to fill the roles in question, the main objection would not be that it was undemocratic, but that it was absurdly unfair to the individuals concerned. The fact that we do find this system thinkable in practice turns mainly on its sheer familiarity. That's just how things are done. And perhaps, as Russell thinks in the case of causation, we're still in the grip of a piece of bad metaphysics. We think of royalty as a natural kind, and hence imagine that it's a natural matter that royal children should be brought up to play these roles. That's the kind of beings they are, as it were. The picture holds it captive, and central to it is the fantasy that what these families enjoy is a matter of entitlement and privilege, not constraint and obligation. It's easy to see how we got to this point from the distant past this picture actually depicts. On the one hand, a great erosion of power on the side of the royalty, as thanks in part to Russell's ancestors in the British case, its powers were curtailed. On the other hand, an even greater expansion of opportunity on the side of ordinary people, especially ordinary children, as we've come to accept that young people should make their life choices for themselves, in many cases, rather than having them dictated by parents or accidents of birth. The combination of these two factors means that the heirs to modern monarchies are now marooned on a little island of underprivilege, impoverished not only compared to their own ancestors, but also, much more importantly, compared to the standards that now exist in the community at large. And here the point connects back to the main themes of my lecture, and indeed of Russell's, broadly interpreted. For what precisely is it that these individuals lack compared to their contemporaries? Of what are they deprived? Essentially, it's counterfactuals. They're deprived of counterfactuals, of opportunities to make decisions about their lives on the large scale, in much the same way that New Jersey is deprived compared to Manhattan about admittedly more trivial matters, to return to Fodor's observation about the real estate market. So the two sides of Russell's famous metaphor come together. The reason we need to be at most armchair anarchists about causation and counterfactuals turns in part on the roles these notions play in human life, and particularly our conception of a rich human life, a life with choices, a life with counterfactuals. It would be unthinkable, probably impossible, to live a life without them, even if they're not fundamental, and even if they have no role in fundamental physics suitably construed. And the great flaw of modern hereditary monarchies lies in the way in which they deprive a few individuals of some of these freedoms. This flaw has precisely the character suggested by Russell's comparison, a significant harm in plain sight to which we are blinded by familiarity and bad metaphysics. So with some renovation then, new foundations provided by Ramsey on the side of causation, and a sympathetic addition of a wing that Russell himself did not construct on the side of the monarchy, Russell's edifice thus turns out to be in remarkably good shape in its second century. That's my view, and there's some evidence that it's the view on the street as well, at least in Manhattan, where this comes from. So please join me once again as Russell's lecture turns 108 in wishing it well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Hugh. So, okay, so I see there are a couple of questions. Can you also see it in the Q&A, Hugh? Maybe I can read it for you. Okay, so the first one is more a clarification question, but I think, well, we can generalize that. So for slide 16, so if you can go back to your slide 16. Yeah. So Hugh, can you go back to, yes, okay. So I don't know whether there is a page number, but
yeah, the page number is in the bottom on the right.
Okay. So on slide 16, so time asymmetry in causation is just the product of difference in us, not difference in reality for Russell. I mean quotation. Can you give further explanation for the difference in us, which is opposite to the difference in reality?
Well, Russell tried to do it in terms of the idea that our memory works backwards. We remember things in the past, but not things in the future. And Russell's phrase is something like, but for the accident. So if it weren't for the accident, the memory is asymmetric in this way. He thinks that we wouldn't have this asymmetric view of causation. So that's when I say that Russell is trying to explain the asymmetry of causation as a product of difference in us, the difference in us, I mean, is the difference, the asymmetry in our memory, the fact that it works backwards but not forwards. Now, I think he's right that it's a difference in us, but he's focusing on the wrong difference. It's not memory that matters, it's agency. It's the asymmetric perspective that we have when we deliberate.
Okay. So actually, when you mentioned agency, there is a relevant question by Connie. So this is, I think, the fourth one I put in the list. So okay, so based on Ramsey's remark, agency is the key to understand causation. Can we conclude that agency is also the key to understand counterfactuals too?
Yes, I think so. I went through that very briefly, but I think that there are passages in the same paper of Ramsey's where Ramsey is really making the point that for deliberation we don't need counterfactuals, we just need hypotheticals. So we're thinking about what will be the case in the actual future, where part of what we're thinking about is something that we take ourselves to have the ability to make true or false. Now, if you start there, if that's enough for an understanding of deliberation, you can then get to counterfactuals by combining, and this is a suggestion that I think Alison Gopnik makes, if we combine hypothetical deliberation of the kind that Ramsey is talking about with our faculty of imagination, so we're able to imagine ourselves in imaginary decision situations. And so we do, there's a possible path to what you might call a subjective or an anthropocentric understanding of counterfactuals too. It's not, I mean, Ramsey doesn't discuss it explicitly. You have to build it on what he does discuss. And you need the ingredient of imagination in order to do it. But it seems to me a plausible way to proceed. And I think if it works, then it will solve the problem of the time asymmetry of counterfactual dependency, just in the way that Ramsey's approach solves the problem of the time asymmetry of causation.
Okay, so let's take another question from the attendees. Okay, so is the notion of causation univocal in fundamental physics and the Markov phenomena? In fundamental physics, we seem to treat cause as something sufficient for determination, but it doesn't seem to fit the everyday idea of causation for Markov phenomena, which includes asymmetry and the locality.
That one's a little bit difficult because I think I mean the ways in which causal notions are used in physics, I think it's very messy, and so there isn't a kind of clean story. You have to look at it case by case. And I don't know exactly what the questioner is thinking about there.
Maybe we can call the questioner. So let me see whether I can. making work. Yeah. Is she or he still there? Let me see. Maybe not. I cannot search for. Yeah. Maybe.
Yanjing, I can't see the list of questions at the moment.
Oh, if you click the Q&A, you will see the. I mean, in the answered ones. So if you click the Q&A, so can you see the control bar?
I'm not getting that at the moment because my screen sharing is getting in the way.
Oh, you can stop sharing and then you can see the control bar. So maybe that's easier.
Oh yes, now
yeah. Okay, so let me put. Okay, now can you see the questions? I mean, in the answered one, there are 6 so far.
Okay, yes, so I've got those.
Yes. So if you can see them, you can pick whatever you like, I mean, to answer.
Okay. Perhaps there's an interesting one at the end of the list here.
Yes.
From Shelley Yiran Shi.
Yes.
If I could take that question a little bit more generally,
please.
and interpret it as a question about the relationship between what I'm interpreting as Ramsey's view and Lewis's view. And perhaps I could explain the point by saying that I think that Lewis's view has a problem which is similar to the problem that that Hartree Field identified for Cartwright's view. And if you think, I mean, remember the problem that Cartwright identified was that if it was true as the problem that Field identified was that if it's true as Cartwright suggested that causation is something in addition to what's given to us by physics, then it's unclear as to how we could know about it or why, in fact, it should be relevant to us, given that we presumably are creatures whose lives are governed by physics. And I think there's a similar issue in the case of the story that Lewis gives us, explaining the asymmetry of counterfactual dependence in terms of a story about possible worlds and a very complicated story about the relationship of similarity between possible worlds. I mean, if you interpret that as something which, coming from the outside, is supposed to explain the difference between effective and ineffective strategies, then it's entirely unclear how the explanation is supposed to work. Why should that, why should that particular structure in terms of possible worlds, especially thought of as sort of concrete worlds different from our own, why should that be relevant to our actions? Why should it be relevant to us in the way that we take it to be? If you go in the other direction, if you start with, as Ramsey does, you start with deliberation, and then in terms of that, construct talk of first of causation and then in counterfactuals, you get an understanding of why these pieces all fit together. And in fact, it's the same kind of understanding that Lewis himself is in favor of in the case of chance. I mean, those of the audience who know Lewis's work in chance, well, you know that he makes central to it a principle he calls the principal principle, which connects beliefs about chance to credences, to subjective probabilities. And he objects to various other approaches to chance by saying that they can't explain that link. So he says it's a kind of constraint on any proper account of chance, that it ought to be able to explain why chances matter in decision in the way in which they do. And in effect, the point I'm making, and this is something I pointed out in various places in print, is that we need to insist on the same principle in the case of causation. And that's in effect the Ramsey program. So we start with deliberation, and then we build our notions of counterfactual reason and causation out from there, just in the way that Lewis himself recommends in the case of chance.
Okay, so
oh, there's a nice question here from Yvette. Can I answer this one? Yvette says, is the notion of causation univocal in fundamental physics and macro phenomena?
yeah, I mentioned this before.
So
yeah. So I was trying to find him or her. Yeah, but this is not.
Okay, so no,
yeah.
Okay, so I can't remember whether you read out the first part, but since I see.
Yes, I read out the first part. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'm inclined to say that well, I did say earlier that trying to understand uses of the notion of causation in physics can be a little bit messy. But one way to think about the question as to whether, in fact, physicists have different intuitions about causation in microphysics than in macrophysics is to look at the way in which assumptions about causation are built into the presuppositions that people operate with when they think about possible models of quantum theory. Because we're thinking about quantum theory, we're thinking about fundamental physics. But in those discussions, one of the features that has interested me for a long time is the fact that those discussions normally presuppose, in particular, they normally presuppose that causation only works in one direction. And there's a sort of class of models for thinking about quantum mechanics which give up that assumption and allow that causality can be more symmetric. And those models have some very interesting advantages, in my view, in making it easier to understand the possible relationship between quantum mechanics and special relativity. But my view is that the difficulty that many physicists seem to have in making sense of those models is an indication that, in fact, it's not true that the notion of causation being employed in microphysics is just some notion of sufficiency or determination, because that would be much more amenable to a symmetric view. So in fact, the ordinary asymmetric intuitions of causality do go right into microphysics, in my view.
Okay. Yeah, there is. I think there are two more questions. One from Zhou Wu Peng. Is there a clear cut between discovering one truth which has already existed, such as law of nature, and making one truth which hasn't yet existed, such as ethical beliefs? When someone found the causality between his childhood and adulthood in his memory, or causality between his childhood and adulthood has been found by someone else, is it discovering or making the truth, respectively? Discovering or making the truth?
I'm not sure if I'm interpreting it in the right way, but the question seems to be alluding to a distinction between I mean, there's a very natural distinction between those things that are there in the world independently of us to be discovered, and those things that in some sense we create as a result of our experience of the world. And one place in which this distinction becomes particularly clear and particularly of interest to philosophers and to, well, the people we would now call physicists, like they then called themselves natural philosophers, is in 17th century Europe, when people like Galileo and philosophers like Locke and Newton, they were all interested, among other things, in what we now call the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So we find wonderful passages in Galileo, for example, where he's saying that things like color and smell and taste, Galileo says they have their residence solely in the sensitive body. In other words, they're not out there in the world independently of us, they come from us. And in some ways, you could think of one of the old projects of philosophy and physics as being trying to draw that distinction properly. And one way to frame the view of causation that I've been supporting and attributing to Ramsey here is to say that it amounts to the view that causation is not as much on the side of the world as we think. It comes from our perspective on the world. So just like color and taste, except that the thing that determines the perspective is not something like our sense or a sense of smell. It's the fact that we're agents. And that was a point that I think I mentioned in the talk, a paper I wrote with my Australian colleague, Peter Menzies, about 30 years ago now, called Causation as a Secondary Quality. And that was the point we're making. So I think it's a very good question, and one which really goes to the heart of the issues that are on the table here. And my own view is that distinction is never perfectly sharp, and that all of our words have a human element in them.
Oh, we also have some question from the panelists, but I think I can let, so Louis, can I find it? Just one. So the question is, are the limits of agency the limits of causation? So it's not in the question list. I can invite Louis to talk to you. Okay, are you there? Hi. So you can talk with Professor Price, or make your question more clear. Are you there? Okay, so the question, yes, we can hear you. Yes.
When we reduce the notion of causation to the notion of agency, to what extent could be causation independent or?
So yeah, we cannot hear you clearly. So okay, so the question was, are the limits of agency the limits of causation? But it's relatively vague. So could you explain a bit more? Okay, sorry, I think we cannot hear you. So yeah, do you want to say something to that, Hugh? It's a vague. Are the limits of agency the limits of causation?
I'm not sure if this is what the question was getting at, but,
yeah.
but one objection that comes up to this kind of view of causation And it was one of the objections that Peter Menzies and I were already considering in that paper of ours that I mentioned. People say that if you try to define causation in terms of agency, then you can't make sense of causation between events where there are no humans involved, or causation in regions of the universe where there couldn't be humans involved. I mean, causation in the middle of the sun, for example. And to that, well, let me say that the general strategy of that paper, the Causation as a Secondary Quality paper, was to argue that several well-known objections to this view of causation being defined in terms of agency were analogous to objections to standard views of secondary qualities. And once you saw that there was that analogy, then you could find an answer to the objection about agency by looking at the standard objections to secondary qualities. And so in this case, what we need to do is to think about what we say about something like color, for example, how we think about the color of objects in regions in which there are no observers. I mean, for example, we could ask questions like, were sunsets red before life evolved on Earth? And we can treat that to be a sensible question, provided we have some sort of hypothetical principles for making sense of the question of well, here again we have a counterfactual. What would a standard observer see if he were in that situation? And we can make sense of that by simply using the sort of underlying laws of physics and so on, and thinking about the same sort of processes that occurred in the atmosphere of the early Earth and what those processes would look like if they allowed now. And so those similar techniques for sort of extending our viewpoint sideways into regions where we can't actually go, I think work for the case of causation too.
Okay.
But it's a very nice, I mean, it's an important discussion. And if that's what your questioner was getting at, then I think it's a very good question.
Yeah. I'm not sure whether that was the original intention, but that's, I mean, your interpretation is definitely an important one. Okay, so let's see probably the last one now in the question list. So here you can also see it, I guess, the last one. So I'm wondering why causal hyperrealism is regarded as unattractive by field or by you. It seems to me that it makes perfect sense to say that symmetry physical law explain only the association between the values of variables involved in an everyday life, everyday causal relation, such as a force on an object makes the object go faster, but doesn't explain the causal connection between these variables.
Okay, that's a very good question. Why is causal hyperrealism is unattractive?
Yeah, unattractive, yes.
I think that there are at least two elements to the answer to that. One is that, and they're related. One is that I think it's very unclear how we could know about what Field calls the causal fluid that this hyperrealist view involves. As I said at one point, we seem to be creatures who are made of physical stuff. The way in which our brains operate and our sense organs operate seems to conform to the laws of physics. How is there any way for the causal fluid to have an influence on that? And it's no good saying that it has a causal influence, because that's the problem that we're trying to account for. And yet, if you said that it was just a sort of an associationist influence, then you'd be back with the original problem by Cartwright's lights. And I mean, the point here is similar to the one that I made when I was talking about Lewis. the problem for these metaphysical, sort of more metaphysical realist views, and the problem that Lewis recognizes so well in the case of chance, is that you need to be able to explain the practical relevance of that sort of metaphysical entity. You can't just postulate it. That's cheating. That's what Lewis says in the case of chance. Well, I think that's enough. So that's the general argument. I think that's what Field has in mind, and it's certainly what I have in mind in thinking that this hyper-realist view is unattractive. So it's a point both about practical relevance and a point about epistemology. It's unclear about how we could know about these things.
So maybe we can ask Wenxin to speak whether she or he likes or to continue a bit. So I mean the questioner just now you answered. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for answering my question. So I don't have any further thoughts.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for your question.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So I see a bit more question now. So. But we are running out of time. So maybe Hugh, you can see the open list. I mean, the last 3 questions. Maybe you can pick one to answer as the last question. I mean, the last 3 questions or an answer. So pick your favorite.
Well, I like the short one in the middle. It says
short one in the middle. Yes.
When
yes,
you
I will
say
make that.
causation depends on things in us.
Yeah, okay. I made it in the answer list, so other people can also see it. Okay, I will read it again. So it's from Xu Zhaoqing. Yeah. When you say causation depend on things in us, will you say that if we had been different, causation might turn out to be different? If so, then it seems to be a regress here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, if I understand this correctly, it's a very nice question. So if I could just rephrase it a little bit. So I want to say that if we'd had the opposite orientation in time, then we would think of causation going in the other direction of time. So that's one way in which I think that if we'd been different, we would have seen causation as being different too. Now, I think what the question is pointing to is that in itself is it's a counterfactual, and so one of the interesting issues for the kind of views that I'm recommending here is that on the one hand, I want to think about questions of the form, what role do these concepts play in our lives? And one way of thinking about that question is to think about the question, how would our lives be different if we didn't have these concepts? So how would our lives be different if we didn't have the concept of causation? Well, we wouldn't be able to deliberate in the way that we do. How would our lives be different if we didn't have the notion of a counterfactual? Well, we wouldn't be able to ask questions like that. And so the title of my talk was sort of deliberately pointing to this kind of circularity that I think the question here is getting at. So I agree that there's a circularity. The question is whether it's a problematic circularity or not. I think it's not problematic. And I think it's the same kind of circularity that we have if whenever we're taking an explanatory perspective on any aspect of our language. Because we can't engage in a study of language without using language, but that doesn't invalidate the inquiry. And similarly, in this case, I think we can't ask a question about how our lives would be different if we didn't have counterfactuals without using counterfactuals. But it's not a vicious circularity. It's not a problematic circularity.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, this also answered another question in the list, which asked exactly about why do you choose this second order nature counterfactual question as the title of your talk. So I think that can be a very happy ending for our exchanges. I do see more questions, and we will forward the questions to Professor Price after the lecture. So I'll probably we can find a way to get back to you or put it public if Professor Price thinks there are something he can still say about the questions. Okay, so I guess time is up, and yeah, thanks a lot for joining us for the first lecture in this lecture series on the mathematical philosophy. So let's thank Professor Price again. Although we don't hear many people clapping, but yeah, you can imagine that how it can be done in a possible world.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you to all the people who asked questions too.